Okay, I want to welcome everybody. And I want to welcome you, Natan. I'll read your bio, if I may, as a way of welcoming you, so people have a small sense from a short bio of a pretty amazing career. I'll tell you, just before reading your bio, I've read you and seen you. So I've read you in Newsweek, and I've read your articles in The Atlantic, and I think I read you in the Huffington Post. I've certainly seen you in broadcasts as well on the major TV networks. So Natan Sachs is a fellow in and director of the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, that's in Washington, D.C. His work focuses on Israeli foreign policy, domestic politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the U.S.-Israeli relations. He's currently writing a book on Israel's grand strategy, we'll talk more about that, and its domestic origins. Natan Sachs has taught on the Arab-Israeli conflict at Georgetown University's Department of Government and Research Design for the Security Studies program at Georgetown. Previously, he was a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia, where his research included an empirical study of the behavioral effects of Islamic and national identities. He was subsequently a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. Natan Sachs earned a bachelor's degree in the Amirim or Amiram? Amirim Excellence Program at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and a master's and doctorate in political science from Stanford University. As I said, he writes for various publications. You'll often see him and hear his voice on topics related to Israel, the Middle East, the U.S.-Israel relationship. So Natan, it's a new year. I want to wish you Shana Tova, particularly to you and your family. And I don't know, how many years have you been away from Israel?
On and off quite a while, since I was 25. It's going on 17 years now, more even. Yeah.
And where is your family there?
In Jerusalem. I'm a Jerusalem. I'm born and bred. I was born in
Jerusalem? What part? Because I know a lot of people watching have been.
I think many have probably been to the German colony.
Sure.
I'm a proud native of the Greek colony, which is the little sister adjacent. Yeah, many of you have probably walked through the Greek colony and thought it was the German one, but I forgive you.
Any shift in the restaurants, or it's the same?
It's shifted a lot. When I was a little boy, we had one, falafel place, and now when I come to my own falafel place, they speak to me in English and French, and I feel rather.
Yeah. Yeah, my association with that area is late night walks when I'm in Jerusalem and going and having great meals. Just a beautiful, fantastic environment. So only days ago, the Abraham Accords were signed. History. And I want to ask you for your perspective on it. What I want to ask you before we get to the implications, because clearly that's, I'm presuming, what we're all thinking about. What does this mean for the region and for the world, and specific parts of that region, relationships that exist and that might exist as a result? How do we get here? How do we get to where behind the scenes things happen and suddenly we're hearing about accords being signed on the White House lawn?
That's a great question, actually. It's worth pausing and thinking about it for a moment. I think there were sort of two processes going on. One has been going on for several years, predates the Trump administration. It really took steam during the Obama administration time, although it really started to a degree before that. And that is a new sort of alignment of interest between Israel and several of the major Sunni Arab states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, chief among them, where they are historical adversaries, obviously. Saudi Arabia officially been of Israel, the UAE never was, honestly. But both now found themselves in a very different position on the other side of a adversarial relationship with Iran. And both sides reliant heavily on the United States, hoping that America would be on their side against Iran, the common enemy. And especially during the Obama years, the Saudis and the Israelis, and to a lesser degree the Emiratis, feeling angry at the Obama administration for the secret talks with the Iranians, and then the JPOA and the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran deal. And not just because of the Obama administration, but also in that context, you sort of have these countries actually trying to align their interests, their diplomacy, pressure the United States. We, of course, remember the very cantankerous relationship between Obama and Bibi Netanyahu, including Netanyahu's speech in Congress against the Iran deal while it was debated in the United States, obviously a very controversial thing in the United States. And here you have all these countries on the same side. So when Trump comes into office, and especially as the years go by, you have these countries looking at the Middle East and thinking, actually, most of our interests are similar, not the same, but similar. I'll add one more element to how they're similar. There are two big camps. Sort of, you have Iran and some of its Shia proxies and allies in the Arab world on one side, and the major Sunni states on the other. But among the Sunni states, there's also rivalries, in particular between the Emiratis and the Saudis on the one hand, and the Turks, not an Arab country, of course, but the Turks and the Qataris, their neighbor in the Gulf, on the other. With the Turks and the Qataris much closer to the Muslim Brotherhood and to Islamist groups. Egypt, before the coup, so under Morsi, was led by the Muslim Brotherhood and was clearly in that camp. And then under Morsi, after the coup, is very hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood, much more so than anyone, perhaps. And so now you have this camp of the anti-Muslim Brotherhood within the Sunnis, also a very cantankerous kind of relationship. Israel has relations with Turkey, full relations. It also has not so secret relations with Qatar, although they're not formal. But Israel obviously prefers the non-Muslim Brotherhood camp in that. So here too, an alignment of interest. Then comes in Trump, and you have the second element of this whole story. Trump decides, to many surprise, that he's going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict where everyone has failed before. And the reason was simple, that everyone until Trump was a terrible negotiator, and Trump would succeed. I was among the skeptics. I think everyone, including probably most people in the White House, were very skeptical this was a good idea, but they were fulfilling his dictum that he would solve it. It would be the deal of the century.
Right.
They attempted to do this. They tried to negotiate. They made enormous blunders, to my mind, in trying to negotiate Israeli-Palestinian peace. But what they managed to do in that context is to circumvent the Palestinians and make this alignment of interest into what I think is a very important and very positive development, which is actual formal treaties between Israel and some of these Sunni Arab states. And that is a major thing. It is not the deal of the century. It's not peace between Israelis and Palestinians. To the contrary, it excludes the Palestinians very explicitly, but it is, in and of itself, I think, a very good thing.
So I remember when you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, one of the questions I had for you, and we were talking about this, and I don't know if you had an answer then or if you do now, is this a great chess game? In other words, Bibi Netanyahu announces for the last couple of months, knowing all the while that they're negotiating with the US and the Emiratis, we are going to annex these parts of Judea and Samaria, and here are the reasons why. And the world, of course, blows up about it, and all the press blows up about it, and there's pressure from the Europeans, and pressure from the Arab states, and pressure, of course, from the Arab League, and from within Israel. Now, my question to you is, was he intent on annexing Judea and Samaria, or was he putting one of his moves to the left, 2 steps forward on the chessboard, knowing there would be a response and knowing that the Emiratis could say, as they did last week in signing that agreement, look, this is going to help the Palestinians. We stopped annexation. So, I wonder if this is really that well thought out or something that's arrived at somewhat by accident.
I fall in the second camp, which is that this is somewhat by accident, but that doesn't mean, whether or not it was thought out or not, there is value exactly in that sort of transaction. Basically, what the Emiratis got, or at least what they can claim to the Palestinians they got, is that Israel shelved annexation. The reports are that the commitment from Israel to the Americans is that annexation would be off for 3 or 4 years. I'm skeptical for few reasons. The first is that usually the answer is simpler than that. And what we saw from Netanyahu was a move that was very much geared towards domestic politics, and also geared towards, I think, what he and a few others perceived as this sort of moment of opportunity where the president of the White House, who may leave in January, we don't know yet, who is willing to break all norms, to change everything, to bend backwards, in particular for Israel, do things that Israel never thought it would get from the United States, at least not anytime soon. And that this moment of opportunity would be a time to cement some things on the border as well. So if you look all the way back to 1993, when Netanyahu publishes a book, A Place Among the Nations, the way he describes sort of a possible endgame, he doesn't go into much detail. There's never actually specific endgame of how he sees Israel's borders. But this, the Trump deal, is certainly very consistent with it. And that's no surprise. The Trump deal, the deal of the century, was negotiated only with Israel. The Palestinians stopped negotiating with the Americans in December 2017 after the move of the embassy. And so what you see is a deal that's very favorable to Israel, and very, in particular, it cements a few of the things that Netanyahu himself wants, including borders, with the American ambassador in Israel immediately saying he expects Israel to annex some of that territory that designated to Israel in the future immediately. We then saw this pushback and Netanyahu wavering. So to answer your question more directly, did he ever intend to annex? I don't know. I do believe he certainly intended to test the waters seriously and was hoping to do that. But he's a very cautious man. He's done many moves in the past where he says, comes up to the brink and then he pulls back. He's very famous for that. And I think this is one of them. There are some important influential people around him who I'm certain were very keen on this and thought this was sort of an historic opportunity. I'll say one more thing on this. The move for annexation was blocked before really we got steam on the negotiations between the Emiratis and the Israelis. And so in a sense, this was a way for everyone to take their feet out of the fire. So sort of Israel could not annex, or it hit a wall, particularly because the White House, or part of the White House, blocked it. And then here was a golden opportunity to leverage that to something that the sides wanted. But just to be clear, and this is sort of the bottom line, I think, with the Emiratis, the annexation or canceling it, postponing it, helps them in selling this deal as saying we're still loyal to the Palestinian cause, etc. But it's not why they did it. They wanted relations with Israel for their own interests. They have long since been tired of the Palestinians, and especially the Palestinian leadership. And so this is a move, this is an opportunity for them to do it, especially under Trump. But it's not, of course, the reason they're doing it.
Yeah, you make me think as well about, the politics of politics, right? And how everybody has self-interest, and did it happen right before an election for this reason, in this country, that country, all these countries are all looking internally at what they're doing and the optics to their own societies. It's not necessarily bad as long as it produces a good result, right? I mean, I'm going to assume that everything that happens on the world stage that isn't accidental or a function of the wind, somebody's thought about the timing of it and the place and getting the cameras in place for it. What's in this for the Bahrainis, the Emiratis? I mean, I know there's a lot in it for them. And then I want to ask you what's in it for Israel and the US as well.
Yeah, well, first on your premise, I agree completely. Most politicians are self-interested and they're trying to be reelected. The ones who don't think about reelected were never elected in the first place. They were not successful politicians. So the leaders we see, they're always self-interested. That's fine. We have sort of, I tweeted this a few days ago. We have a tacit agreement with leaders, which is if you do something good, you can celebrate yourself and describe yourself as a genius. It's fine. Enjoy, as long as you do the right thing. What's in it for them? Well, for the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, two different cases. For the Emiratis, this is a way to do a few things. First, open some of the relationship which would be beneficial to them. There's already has been a lot of contact between Israel and the Emiratis on intelligence, on diplomatic cooperation, on security, arms deals, and other transfers. But nonetheless, here you have open relations, flights between Dubai and maybe Abu Dhabi and Israel. The private sector now can do things that it didn't do before, not because it was necessarily barred from it, but just because the opportunity wasn't there. You have huge opportunities. And the Emiratis are quite different from many of the other Gulf states. They're not a nice democracy by any means, but they are a country that is significantly more secular than some of the others, and more forward-looking in the sense of trying to diversify their economy away from just oil. They are extremely wealthy, with a very small citizenry. Most of their population is foreign workers who are not citizens, and they have an enormous amount of oil and gas. But nonetheless, some of what the wealth there has nothing to do with energy or is not directly dependent on it. Dubai, for example, which is an enormous financial hub, travel hub, that's not actually that wealthy in terms of energy. It's Abu Dhabi, the capital that is the principate of Abu Dhabi is what has most of the energy. So for them, this is a way, in part, to do good, to open up to Israel and to have cooperation on that side. For the Bahrainis, it is an attempt to join that kind of chorus. It is also important to remember with the Bahrainis, Bahrain is a special place. It has a Sunni ruler. It is heavily backed and propped up by Saudi Arabia, but it has a Shia majority population. And there's also much more opposition in Bahrain to this agreement because of that. Not because they're Shia, but because there's more of an opposition. And so for Bahrain, this may first be a move by Riyadh, by Saudi Arabia as a test balloon. It's also a way for Bahrain to curry favor with the United States. And that's important to remember in general. For many people in the world, the perception is that the road to Washington goes through Jerusalem, that the way to play nice with the United States is first to play nice with Israel. And sometimes the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that the Jews control the world are helpful in that regard, because everyone thinks that Israel manipulates
the
everything.
gatekeeper, yeah.
Exactly. And so that is partly true here. The Emiratis already have a direct line to the White House, at least this White House. And that's my final point here. The Saudis are extremely close to the Trump administration, and especially via the son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So are the Israelis and the Emiratis. The Saudis may be facing a very different reality if Joe Biden wins or if a Democrat wins later. Saudi Arabia is unpopular in the United States. It's had terrible strategic missteps in recent years under the Crown Prince MBS. And we've already seen a very different tune from Democrats, including Joe Biden himself. And it may be, I don't know, but it may be the Emiratis are trying to also put some daylight between them and themselves and the Saudis, and be now a very good actor in Washington circles, not just with the Trump administration, get the Israelis on their side too. And they're not turning their back on Saudi Arabia by any means, but they're not quite as tight as they were just a couple of years ago on several fronts, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere. So that might be part of it too. Again, not to overstate this, they're not divorcing Saudi Arabia, they're very close. But there is here sort of an independent action going significantly ahead of what the Saudis could do.
You mentioned the Bahrainis who are Shiite, and I was thinking about obviously the linkage to Iran, Shiite Iran. So is that part of their alliance? Is that part of their loyalty, that they're Shiite opposing a Sunni act, essentially?
So the population, which is Shia majority, is sort of conflicted. It's both Shia, like Iran, but Arab, like the Arab world, and not like Iran. There are, of course, some Arabs in Iran as well, but Iran is predominantly Persian and other ethnicities, and the language is, of course, Farsi. So they're conflicted. It's a bit like in Iraq. In Iraq, the largest group is Shia, but Arab. And we've seen them on the one hand fight with Iraq in the terrible and 8-year-long war with Iran, but on the other hand now be very close to Iran politically in the modern Iraq. So that's part of the story in Bahrain. That is certainly the story that the Saudis believe. So they certainly see this as a fight with Iran. And I should be clear, the Iranians perceive Bahrain to be what used to be a province of Iran. So they certainly have had their eyes on it. And that's not lost on the Saudis. Nothing Iran does is lost on the Saudis, and then some. Things that they don't do are also not lost.
So they're obviously denouncing everything. I mean, they see this as in alliance with the devil, America and Israel. Also, you mentioned Dubai. Isn't Dubai a banking and trade hub for Iran as well?
Yes, that's a bit of the irony here. So the Emirates in general, and Dubai in particular, actually have a lot of trade with Iran. They're very close to Iran, of course, and Iran, their relationship is complex. The hostility between the Emiratis and the Iranians is not the same. It's not as severe as between the Saudis and the Iranians. In Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis are very, very strict fundamentalists. Sunni interpretation is very strong. It's less so these days, but it's still very dominant. And they almost see Shia, they often will say Shia are not even Muslim. And of course, Iran is the leader of the Shia world and sees itself as a religious power, not just a secular one. The Emiratis are different. It's not that they're not Muslim or not strict, and there are quite strict rules in the Emirates. If you go to Dubai and Abu Dhabi, be careful about what you do, but that's not the same thing. The Emiratis, the Emirates in general are a much more secular place, much freer. Saudis will often go to Dubai to party. And you'll see, so for them, the animosity with Iran is complicated. This is a big loss for Iran because that struggle of where the Emiratis will end up eventually is important. Not that Iran could pry them away from Saudi Arabia, but they could hope, and in the past we have seen, the Gulf being more nuanced and more complex in its relations with Iran. Oman certainly has relations, the Emiratis at certain times. Even Saudi Arabia has not always had this level of animosity. Under different rulers, it's been somewhat different, and under different iterations of the regime in Iran. So yes, it's a complex game and a very important one. Iran is always on the mind of the rulers in the Gulf, and especially in Riyadh.
So this, my impression is this isn't about Iran, but it's in relation to Iran, this decision.
Very much. Everything that's done, and for Israel, of course, Netanyahu is famous for saying many, many times that Israel has three priorities: Iran, Iran, and Iran. And
Right.
that really is a lot of what's going on.
So I want to go one level higher in the game, which is we have these, these states in the Middle East. What about behind them? You have these giant powers like the US, and you have China, and you have Russia. And you have, of course, Turkey in that mix also, and they're hostile to these kinds of deals. What happens with Iran, for instance, and Turkey, who now turn to their benefactor, Russia particularly, for arms, and China potentially, or Korea, you probably know better than I do, North Korea, and say we need to bolster everything we're doing? I mean, does this bring them closer to negotiating? Does this bring them to a better deal potentially with whoever is the next president and administration in the US, or does this push them away from that?
Those are two good questions, and I'm not sure I have satisfactory answers to them. On the first issue, I don't think the deal between Israel and the Gulf in and of itself changes the Iranian calculation, but it is part of a general process. And as you say very correctly, I mean, the question of what Russia and China do in the Middle East is a very big one. We've seen the United States, these past two presidents who've been very different from one another, shall we say, both reluctant to be engaged in the Middle East, at least compared to George W. Bush. Obama was certainly much more reluctant than W. And Trump has been sort of a bit contradictory, but in some fundamental ways, much more reluctant even than Obama, frequently saying not only about the Middle East, why on earth should the United States foot the bill for any ally, certainly NATO, but also the Saudis, who say that explicitly about Saudi Arabia. Nonetheless, also willing to use force in very particular points, but desiring actually to pull out forces from Syria and elsewhere. So you have this case of the United States to a degree. It's sometimes overstated, but in the region, it's often perceived as retrenching from the Middle East. And Russia reemerging into Syria, already in 2013 and a bit before, and China looming in the background. Now, China is complicated. China's not involved in the Middle East in the ways that the US, the Soviet Union, and now Russia do. But it may not be far out. China is already heavily invested in many regions of the world as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, which includes enormous investments in infrastructure, sometimes with huge loans. Some would call them predatory loans. And that includes the Middle East. It includes investment in Israel too, although without the loans. And that includes at least a draft agreement this summer with Iran, a huge one that would actually dwarf, I think, anything else in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, that would include cooperation with Iran on infrastructure and banking and military affairs and cyber affairs and a whole host of things. There's opposition to it in Iran. It's sort of a new colonialism from China, and I don't know if it'll actually happen, but potentially it's huge. And with Saudi Arabia, we've seen also some cooperation as well, which is interesting because they're, of course, big rivals. The backdrop to all of this, and really this is the key point to remember, when we think of China and we think of Russia or Iran or Saudi Arabia, one of the first questions we have to ask is, are they buying or selling oil? And both Saudi and potentially Iran, although much less now, are huge producers of energy. China is an enormous importer, and it needs the energy. So for China, the interests in the Middle East are pretty clear. Be nice, especially to the energy producers. China has tried to play nice with everyone, Israel included. It hopes not to choose sides. It's not so much in that game. Will it, in the next decades, find itself embedded in the Middle East the way the United States or Russia have been? I don't know. They don't want to, but it could happen. And even if it happens only to a limited degree, that, of course, will scare the United States tremendously. So does this push Iran and to a degree maybe Turkey towards others? Maybe. I don't think this deal alone will do it, but certainly the process of the last few years of this perception that the United States does not see itself as the hegemon of the Middle East anymore, that causes everyone to start to look everywhere, look around and say, okay, how do I play nice with the other big powers? Russia is right there in Syria, so Israel has to deal
Right.
with it directly. And everyone is always thinking about China because I don't know if you know this, but China's very big.
Yeah, apparently. We talked about two presidents that are very different, obviously, in every way. One of the things, my impression is, we've had American presidents since 1948 that have loved Israel, and American presidents who haven't seemed to care enough about Israel, Republican and Democrat, if I'm right, on both sides of that. I don't know if that's a pattern, if that's true that there is no pattern. What's the reality for Israel on, there are many people, obviously, if you're a Joe Biden supporter, you're saying to supporters of Israel, you're misunderstanding Trump. He's not actually good for Israel. If you're a Trump supporter, you're saying you're misunderstanding Biden and Obama, and this is essentially the same policymaker, that's the assumption, that wasn't good for Israel. How do we make sense of that as Americans, as voters, as Jews, as people who are looking at Israel as an item in November on our list of priorities?
That's the easy question. So I'll start with a caveat, which is I think probably like your synagogue, the Brookings institution has no partisan position. It doesn't support anyone. I personally do have my own opinions, and I am free to voice them. But I'll try to answer it analytically more. We've had Israel support from both parties. Traditionally, the Democratic Party was the more Israel supportive party, starting with Truman, recognizing Israel famously 11 minutes after the Declaration of Independence, and with Republicans tending to be, in the past, the old Republican Party tending to be the much more skeptical of Israel and in general of many foreign involvements. That changed somewhat perhaps in the 70s, but until then, Republicans usually much more skeptical of foreign involvement, including Israel. There was also, not to mince words, there was more anti-Semitism among some of the groups who supported Republicans, who tended to be certain segments that saw Jews and many other immigrants as less favorably. Of course, this is a sweeping generalization. Many of them were not. Now, among the Democrats, there were their own issues, but Jews were sort of part of that group. Of course, there was a lot of anti-Semitism too, because that's never missing.
Right.
It's changed over the years. I mean, what has changed is less about the parties in the United States and more in general about American support for Israel. If we think back to the early 90s, George H.W. Bush, the father, he had a very mild, actually, kind of sanction against Israel, conditioning part of the loan guarantees that the America was giving Israel to absorb immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Olim. It was conditioned that it wouldn't go to settlements. It never actually came to fruition because Israel didn't need all the guarantees. But a very, very mild thing. Nonetheless, for Jews, he and Jim Baker were seen as potentially very hostile. That's the kind of thing you would never see today from a Republican president. It doesn't matter what his name is. I personally don't think Trump cares one way or the other about this or many other things. But politically, he sees an advantage in going in one direction. And it would be true, I think, of another Republican president. For Israel, that change has not just been about Republicans. It has been a change in the United States in general. Israel is much more popular today, and certainly a few years ago, than it was in the early 90s or in the 80s. Then Americans, many of them saw their interests in the Arab world, certainly in the context of the 70s with the oil embargoes, and it was much more complex. Today, Israel is extremely popular. And that popularity has been promoted in particular with a very strong dictum of bipartisanship, which is that Israel and most of the main Israel supporters, AIPAC included, have always gone, to great lengths to portray at least bipartisanship. That has changed, and we shouldn't mince words about it. Today, the relationship is very strong. I think it faces some dramatic headwinds going forward. And it's not because of Biden. I think Biden, as they say in his kishka, he's very pro-Israel. It's a running joke in D.C. that if you hear Biden speak in anything about the Middle East, sooner or later he's going to mention his first visit to Israel where he met Golda Meir and she said a specific sentence to him, etc. And it's really a joke. He sort of casts like a bingo game. And I think Harris, Israel actually dodged a bullet there. I think Harris is very supportive of Israel. So that's not an issue. The issue is more that in these battles, especially between Netanyahu and Obama, and with the prolonged conflict with the Palestinians, and the perception, the widespread perception that Israel is the Goliath in that fight, not the David facing the huge Arab world, as it was for decades, for Americans too, watching it and seeing 67, tiny Israel trying to survive against an onslaught of huge countries that neighbor it. Egypt is 10 times the size of Israel. Today, it's mighty Israel against these tiny Palestinians who have no power. Which is also partly true. And the result is that you have a combination of two things. One, those who would like to identify with underdogs, those who fight for justice in general, for anyone who's oppressed, will naturally see Israel on the wrong side of things. A lot of changes in Israel recently, also nation-state bill and a few other things have contributed to that. Secondly, the battles between Netanyahu and Obama naturally made Democrats very angry at Netanyahu, and almost irrespective of the substance of it. If you go to battle with someone that I support, and if you're a Democrat, you usually supported Obama, then you saw Netanyahu on the other side. Then, to put it facetiously, he had the audacity to win because the United States withdrew from the JCPOA under Trump. And then we find him chumming up enormously to Trump and flattering Trump and making a point of it. Now, leaders abroad would say that's how you deal with Trump. You have to flatter him, and that's just what every leader in the world knows he has to do. But Netanyahu has been very good at it. And this is not lost on Democrats either. So, when you bring politics home, at the end of the day, people can have opinions about Israel, but most Americans, they maybe care, but they don't care that much. It's a foreign country far away. They do care about Donald Trump or about Joe Biden, whoever they are, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they care tremendously. In the United States right now, it's extremely polarized, as everyone knows. You love Trump or you hate Trump. There's very, very few people in between. Netanyahu, for Democrats, is very, there's no two ways about it. He's on the wrong side of that. And the question is, therefore, how does a Netanyahu navigate a Biden administration if Biden wins? I don't know. And secondly, after Netanyahu leaves office, if he ever does, then, which I used to say will be soon now, I have no idea if ever, but if he ever leaves office.
When Putin leaves, he leaves, isn't that
right? Then, I'm saying this because I wrote a piece and it was titled, The End is Nigh for Netanyahu. And, sometimes you blame the editors because they give actually the titles for pieces. People don't know this, but they give the title. But the truth is it's my fault. The title I suggested was very close to that. And I was just wrong because Netanyahu is better at politics than I am. So the short of it is, after Netanyahu, how does Israel face a Democratic Party? Will Israel be associated with the other side, or will that go away with Netanyahu? All these are open questions, and they're ones that I think Israel and anyone who supports the U.S.-Israel relation has to think about very carefully, because, the good thing about the Republican and Democratic Party both is that neither is in office forever. And so if you want a stable relationship between the two countries, you better have a decent relationship with both parties, no matter what side you belong to.
It's going to shift one way or the other, absolutely.
That's the
because you're dealing with a president who is of one party and a Congress who's with him or without. So you're constantly having to navigate that relationship. What I don't know these days is anything about the Palestinian leadership other than headlines and some stories that I read, and I tend to read them from the American or Israeli press. What do we know? What don't we know about leadership in the Palestinian territories now?
So I should say I'm happy to answer. I'll try, but I should say this is partly secondhand. I'm not a huge expert on the Palestinian side. Look, you have the Palestinians in one of their lowest points politically, diplomatically in decades. Maybe since the mid-'80s, after they were kicked out of Lebanon by Israel and found themselves in faraway Tunis, and just a few years later supporting Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, and therefore shunned from the Gulf as well. So really shunned by everyone, losing the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc who were supporting them. Today, again, we find them very, very isolated, with no prospects of peace with Israel, with no backing in the Gulf, as we just saw, with the traditional Arab states outside the Gulf completely occupied with their own problems. Egypt is dealing with itself and is also not very sympathetic to them. They are also, of course, also split. The Palestinian leadership, which we usually talk about, PLO, and the Palestinian Authority that emanates from it, control the West Bank. They don't control the Gaza Strip. That's controlled by Hamas, which itself is in very different camp to all of these things. So Hamas is closer to Qatar to a certain degree. It also gets some support even from Iran, although they are a Sunni Islamist group. And then you have Abbas, who leads the PLO, but also his own party, Fatah, the major party of Palestinians, and the Palestinian Authority, which was created by the Oslo agreements, which rules in the West Bank. He is old, he's not well. He's also very set in his ways. So old is not really a number, of course. Old is more about him being extremely set in his ways, stubborn. He's not charismatic like Arafat, his predecessor, who had enormous faults, but was also charismatic. And Abbas is very unpopular in the Gulf, especially among the Emiratis. So in a terrible state. What would happen after Abbas? I guess that's always an important question. The short answer is we don't know. Technically, by the Palestinian Constitution, if a president dies in office, the Speaker of Parliament becomes temporary president. There's one little problem. The Speaker of Parliament is from Hamas. And I would evaluate the chances that Fatah agrees to a president from Hamas to be 0. So we could see probably someone else from Fatah emerge. It could be sort of a consensus candidate, maybe the current prime minister, Shtaye, maybe someone else, Ilalul, or a few other people from sort of the mid-generation, as it's called. Or we could see some real fractionalization. We could see the 3 hats that Abbas carries, wears. He's head of the PLO, which means he's sort of the accepted leader of the Palestinians everywhere, outside in the diaspora, refugees as well, but also, as I said, Fatah and the PA. Each one of those might be a different person, sort of a triumvirate, a weak triumvirate. We could even see some fighting. I mean, that's possible. I don't, you never predict that, and I don't know if it'll happen, but it's not out of the question. And even if they resolve that, it would only be for the West Bank and for some of the refugee camps in Lebanon, etc. Gaza is still controlled by Hamas. So in short, they are in shambles, in a very sorry state. I would just say, as an Israeli too, it's not cause for celebration. The cooperation, especially between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, has been instrumental in keeping down terrorism in Israel itself. And that's been a decision by Abbas with his enormous faults, and there are many. He has been very consistent on that, as opposing the use of resistance, as they would call it. He even opposed the Second Intifada in real time. So in that sense, the days after Abbas, or a dissolution of the PA, which is not out of the question, or a collapse, not a dissolution, those would be very bad developments for Israel, and one that I think Israel should try to stave off urgently. It's not so much the way the Israeli government is thinking today, and the deal with the Gulf, it strengthens very much the mood in Israel that we can ignore the Palestinians, because here we can even have peace with the Arabs without resolving Palestinian issues.
Right. I want to ask you about, I want to do 2 things, if you don't mind, Natan. One is take a break from the current reality and ask you about something in the past, and then shift to your thesis, essentially, which is Israel's grand strategy, if I'm stating it correctly, and find out what your thoughts are. But one of the questions that I have is, a lot of people don't know history, right? I certainly have a limited scope of what I know. How did we get here? How did we get to the Middle East that we know today? I know that's too big a question. That's a series in a university, but how do we get to the leadership and the relationships that we have in the state surrounding Israel, let's say? I'm thinking about 1917 forward, that kind of era.
Well, it's a big question. I'll try and think sort of how would I characterize it in sweeping terms. So 1917, we still, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So for centuries, literally, the Turks ruled from Constantinople, nominally with a caliph, so nominally with a leader of the Islamic world, not just leader politically, but religious leader. Caliph is like machlif in Hebrew, the word for replacement for the prophet. And so we're merging from Ottoman colonialism, in a sense, into a world in which Arab nationalism rises. And even prior to that, in the 19th century, Egyptian semi-independence emerges with a lot of British help. But it's not independence from Ottoman, Turkish-based colonialism into mere independence. It's with a lot of involvement from other powers, in particular the British and the French early on. They beat the Ottomans in the First World War, and in 1917, the British take what was then Palestine and became British Palestine. The French took Syria and Lebanon, was the French mandate. The British took what is now Israel, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Iraq. And so we have several different trends going on. We have the colonial powers, especially Britain and France then. We have Arab nationalism growing, based in particular then starting in the Hijaz around Mecca and Medina, but taking shape mostly in Damascus and then later in Baghdad. This is based around the Hashemite family, which now rules Jordan, but for a while ruled Iraq and for a very short while in Damascus too. And they are direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, so very prominent in that regard. But Arab nationalism, it takes form before too long, especially in the 50s and 60s, it takes a different shape, which is a much more leftist shape with a strong socialist bent. The most important figure there being Gamal al-Nasser, the leader, the president of Egypt, who kicks the British out and is sort of the big anti-colonial Arab nationalist leader, manages for a short time nominally to unite Egypt with Syria and Iraq, but mostly ruling from Egypt. That crashes to a certain degree in 1967 with the failure of the Arab states against Israel. And Israel is very central to this story, because if you think of the Arab world, stuck right in the middle there and preventing geographic continuity, even between the parts of what was then the United Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria, was Israel. And so that was always a big cause. It was a cause, though, not only for the nationalists. After Nasser and the demise of sort of his brand of Arab nationalism, which was not only his, it was also the Ba'ath Party is also a very leftist nationalist party that took power in Syria and in Iraq separately. After them, you see a rise of a very different brand of politics, Islamist politics, which takes form in particular in opposition exactly to that secular nationalism. So usually people's fights are fiercest when they're at home, right?
Right.
And so you see Islamism arise in the Arab world. It starts much earlier, but it rises in the Arab world in Egypt and elsewhere, and then in Iran, of course, with the Iranian Revolution in '79. And so in many Muslim countries, not only in the Middle East, you'll see nationalists versus Islamists sometimes as the major fault line in politics. Are you a nationalist and therefore more secular? You'll see women involved in politics. You'll see less headscarves.
In Turkey also, the same model.
In Turkey, very much, although with a different history. So Turkey emerges from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire into a modern Turkey formed by Mustafa Kemal, the Ataturk, the father of the Turks, as a Turkish republic, so dissolving the caliphate, but establishing a Turkey that manages to push back against the British to a degree and earn sort of a sense of national pride and respect. But it is only Turkey now. Not controlling the whole Middle East. And it is a Turkey that is avowedly secular, ultra-secular, so banning certain elements of Islam. For example, wearing a headscarf in public was either prohibited or shunned for many, many years. Erdogan, the current president's wife, I think, was the first wife of a senior leader to wear one in public. Whereas before Erdogan, or before his party, the AKP, came to power, you saw secularism backed by the military, which was in charge of maintaining secularism, being really the dominant force. Turkey today is completely different. Turkey is ruled by a moderately Islamist party, sort of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated. Erdogan openly promoting religion as part of public life. And and the military losing its power, in particular after the failed coup attempt against Erdogan. In the Arab world, it's a different story, it's a different history, of course, but you also see the Islamism partly on the rise. That culminates, the next big point we have to talk about is 2011 with the Arab Spring, as it was known, or the big uprisings. There you see Islamist parties, in particular in Egypt, the largest Arab country, actually win elections, actually win the presidency. And then be kicked out by a military coup with quite a bit of popular support for the coup. And so you see now a strong backlash against Islamism or Islamist parties, but not in the name of secular nationalism necessarily, more in the name of individual nationalism of each country, not pan-Arab nationalism, of Egypt for Egyptians, of taking care of national interests. For Israel and for others, that also opens some opportunities, of course. You can cut deals with Sisi, the president of Egypt. He is much more open about security cooperation with Israel than even Mubarak, his predecessor. On the other hand, Sisi is significantly more oppressive even than Mubarak, which is saying something. And so you are cutting a deal with a dictator, not with the people. I'm not sure you could cut a deal with the people, but that is a precarious situation to be in. It's partly true about the deal with the Gulf that we just saw. You know, you're cutting deals with unelected rulers, royal families. Of course, they have the benefit of not having any citizens. I'm exaggerating, but having very few citizens, so they don't really have to ask them much. It would be different with Saudi Arabia. It'd be different with other countries where there's a bigger population and a more complex system. I'll just say the last word. I'll say after 2011, you know, one big fault line to think about is the countries that have simply managed to keep it together and those that have not. The Arab world is in a very weak position right now. It starts with the Arab states themselves, governance in the Arab states, the ability of the state to deliver basic goods, security, but also health and education, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. All this is not obvious in many of these countries. Egypt is a huge country, very poor, with enormous problems. And Egypt is first and foremost trying to figure out how it will economically survive the next decade. That means that a lot of the regional sort of questions are relegated to other countries. In the past, you know, when we asked what happens in the Middle East, we would say, okay, what does Cairo say? What does Damascus say? What does Baghdad say? Now, what does Washington say? Today, if you ask me what's happening in the Middle East, I don't know. I don't mention any of those three capitals first. I would say Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, maybe the Emiratis, Israel, Turkey, which is not Arab, Iran, which is not Arab. Really only one major Arab country, Saudi Arabia, sort of counts. And the reason it does is because it's extremely wealthy. And so it was able to get through 2011 with that wealth, which won't last forever, I should say, but still exists.
To Israel's grand strategy.
Another easy question. So, you know, in part, sort of the way I'm sort of seeking this grand strategy is as a question, right? I found myself over the years in different iterations of trying to write this book and then setting it aside, asking Israelis, does Israel have a plan? What does it want? So let me phrase it differently. I mean, if I tell you a lot of things about Israel, the one thing I cannot tell you is what are its borders? What's the eastern border of Israel? Does it include Hebron? Does it not? There's a Jewish settlement in Hebron. There are Israeli police that control it. Part of Hebron is Area C, so under complete Israeli control under the Oslo Accords. But then part of Hebron is Area A, under full Palestinian control under the Palestinian Accords. What does Israel plan to do with that in the long term? And usually the short answer I get from many Israelis, I won't do the Israeli accent, but you can imagine it's a very short book. No, you're done. You know, Mazal tov, yeah, you have a book. No, does Israel have a plan, question mark? No. But that's a bit flippant and easy. Most countries don't have grand plans for most of what they need to do. They usually have the advantage of already knowing what their borders are and who their citizens are. And Israel does not. And that's really the big question, or part of the big question for Israel, which is if you don't know what your borders are, you don't know who are the citizens, and you haven't decided, will the Palestinians who reside in the West Bank, will they be Israeli citizens or not? If they will be, what happens to a Jewish majority democracy, the Zionist dream? Could be a Jewish majority country, but not a democracy, or it could be a Jewish state, but not a democracy, or it could be a democracy, but then you'd probably lose at least a lot of the Jewish state. Or you could give up some of the land, but then the question remains, which part? What does Israel exactly want? I go through a lot of the different answers. The interesting thing is, of course, that Israel is about 9 million people today, and I think everyone listening here knows that if you put 2 Jews in a room, you have at least 3 opinions. So you can imagine how many plans Israel actually has. But for many Israelis, the answer is they don't have a plan. And the reason is that Israelis, to a large degree, have resigned themselves to what I call anti-solutionism, which is to say, I'll put it a bit flippantly again. You naive Americans who think that everything in the world has a nice, neat solution to it, you're the one who's mistaken. Most problems in the world are like my arthritis, which unfortunately I have at 44. It won't be solved. I will live with my arthritis throughout my life, and I will just try to do the best I can. And this, I think, is typified most centrally by Netanyahu, by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has won many elections now. And even when he doesn't win them, he manages to form a government. And he has been popular in part because he's been successful in managing a country that is constantly living on the sword. He once said to his own party faction, people ask me, will we live on the sword forever? The biblical term. And he said, yes, of course we will. That is how we will live. Now, this can sound very grim, very cynical, especially to Americans. It is the way that many Israelis think about it when they do. I think it has some wisdom to it. I mean, in some ways, if it's done properly, it can be a good conservative approach, and sometimes conservatism is called for. So if things are crazy in the Middle East, you sometimes want to be very cautious about what you design.
Right. The best version of the status quo, essentially.
Exactly. At its worst, though, and I think Israel is not doing it correctly by any means, you find a situation where you're undermining your own position over time. So by postponing the decision, you are undercutting your own freedom of action in the future. So Israel today finds itself perhaps unable to separate from the West Bank and stuck with a very large Palestinian population that is both hostile to Israel, uninterested in living under Israeli rule, but also one that Israel itself does not want to incorporate as citizens for the reasons I mentioned.
But you think that's because of delay after delay?
It is partly delay after delay, but it's not as mundane as that. What you have in Israel is you have sort of agreement on means, but not so much an end. So it's not that Israelis just don't think about the future, it's that they have very different, sometimes opposing opinions on what they should be. On the right in Israel, on the right wing in Israel, there are those who very explicitly say Israel should annex not just some of Area C, but the whole West Bank. Some of them would say give the Palestinians citizenship. Most of them would say don't. And if the Americans call that Jim Crow or non-democracy or a worse word that starts with an A, so be it. We live in the Middle East, and that's just the way it is. This is biblical land. This is, we're not going to give up Judea and Samaria, and tough. And if they want citizenship, they can go elsewhere. There are those many on the center who would like to separate from the Palestinians, perhaps even into a two-state solution still, that used to be more popular, but are very skeptical that that is possible. By the way, that's mirrored on the Palestinian side, where you probably still maybe have a plurality in support of a two-state solution, but extreme skepticism that Israel would ever genuinely go for it. And then on what remains of the Israeli left, which is rather small these days, you have still also those who talk about still a two-state solution more in the older sense. You have some voices on the margins who are talking about other models. They're few and far between in Israel, but they exist, of confederacy or even of a one-state model, either a binational state or a secular state with sort of a national state. Again, these are very small groups in Israel. It's not a prevalent voice. And by the way, among Palestinians, it's a smaller voice than some people say, but it's growing.
What's a binational state? What does that look like? Is there an example of it?
Yes, so not binational, but multinational or multi-confessional would be Lebanon, which is a huge success story. It's not, of course, but that is one where you have into the constitutional arrangement, you have basically, in fact, a very formal division of power. You'll always have a Christian Maronite president, Sunni prime minister, a Shia speaker of parliament, etc. And, a Druze speaker of parliament. Then you'll find Belgium, to a certain degree, is a binational state with two different languages and nationalities cohabitating. They live in peace, but it's a very tense peace. So they aren't killing each other, but they can't even form a government usually. Some would say Canada is sort of an arrangement with at least two cultures, right? It's a complicated one, and once in a while you have a referendum on secession. But
Sure.
Excuse me?
Like Scotland, nations within a confederacy.
That's right. Now, I would say I'm very skeptical of these possibilities in the context of Israel and the West Bank, or certainly Gaza Strip. Because in most of these cases, I mean, Lebanon is a case of why it doesn't work, but in other cases, what you usually have is first a solution to the basic question of security among communities, which is to say, when people raise the Confederacy issue with me, I tend to think that in the Confederate ideas, there are a lot of interesting elements that could be part of a peace deal between the Israelis and Palestinians. But they usually will say that some of the details need to still be figured out, or that the parties would have to agree. And let me name three of these details. One, who is the chief of the military? Is that an Israeli or is that a Palestinian? Who decides what law of return applies? The Jewish law of return that allows any Jew to make aliyah to Israel, or the Palestinian law of return that would allow any refugee or the descendants to come back to Palestine? And who decides on the division of land and water, and particular land in this case? If you answer those questions, then in a sense you've solved the conflict, or at least some of the elements of the conflict. But if you cannot, then they're not details, they are the core. And I'll just make it clear, if the chief of the military is a Palestinian who happens to be a former Hamas person, most Israelis I know would rationally do everything to prevent that. And so what you have here is a recipe for civil war, which is often the case. And when you think about it, we had one state. Under British Palestine, there was one state, and it devolved into civil war more than once, and it ended in partition, to a very, very bloody, painful, difficult partition. So I'm very wary of that.
So it sounds like you're making a case for anti-solutionism. You
No.
can't say, I mean, maybe I'm misreading it or I'm pushing you a little on it. I don't know.
No, the case I want to make, so I think anti-solutionism, as at least done by Israel for quite a while now, is leading us towards that one-state reality. It's not a constitutional one state where Palestinians have citizenship, but it is already a one-state reality where one state rules both peoples, or big chunks of both peoples. I believe the only way, especially for Israel, which is more my interest, is political separation. And that means Palestinian independence in some form or another. I think it would be something along two-state solution lines, but it may be quite different than the two-state solutions we've talked about in the past. But without separation, political separation from the Palestinians, and a modicum of independence for Palestinians, and more than a modicum, but serious independence that will allow them to govern their own affairs, and a modicum of a sense of at least dealing with the grievances that both sides have, not solving them, because I don't think there is a solution to that. I don't think otherwise one would be able to extract oneself from this reality. But let me say, there's one element of the very cautious anti-solutionist approach that I do think is correct, which is we do have to reconcile ourselves to the possibility, the reality, that whoever the next president is, if it's Trump or if it's Biden, they're not, I don't think, I'd be happy to be wrong, they're not reaching Israeli-Palestinian peace, partly because it's not for them to reach, but there won't be Israeli-Palestinian peace. And therefore, how we manage this conflict in the interim, and how we manage the reality of on the ground, in the West Bank, but also in the Gaza Strip, not as a battle of who's right and who's wrong, because I have strong opinions on that, but not as that, but as a pragmatic question of how we improve the lives there and allow in the future to reach political separation. If we don't do that, we will continue to dig our own hole. And unfortunately, to my mind, at the moment, we are digging. It's not that we're pausing. We are actively digging, we, Israel in particular. And that, to my mind, is a grave mistake.
We've hit an hour and 2 minutes, I think, or 1 minute. I'm really grateful to you. I know you need to go. I wish you and your family a Shana Tova. Hope that all goes well, that you stay healthy, that you're not holed up for too long in DC of all places. I'm so grateful to you. I'm so grateful to have met you and the couple conversations we had. And I hope one day in DC or here to be able to see you and shake your hand and thank you for this conversation.
Rabbi, thank you really very much. It's been truly a pleasure for me as well. And I just regret this has to be via Zoom. It's the strange times we're in. But I'm wishing you and the whole congregation a Shana Tova, Modina Simcha, a meaningful Tzom also on Yom Kippur. And I hope this coming year is at least 10 times better than the previous one, because we're due for something better.
Absolutely. Thank you, Natan Sachs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yom Lecha.